The snip of the scissors cut through the air like a blade, followed by a stunned silence. Golden brown locks of hair floated to the pavement. A gasp rippled through the quiet cul-de-sac, but no one dared to move. Daniel's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as they reached up, touching the jagged strands that remained. His hair. His identity. Gone. He blinked up at the woman standing in front of him, Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. She held the scissors aloft like a weapon, her face twisted in satisfaction. "There," she said, her tone cold. "Now, you finally look presentable." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He felt sick, his vision blurry with tears. "My hair—" His voice came out barely above a whisper. Karen sighed dramatically, as if he were the one being unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just hair. It'll grow back." "This neighborhood has standards, young man. We can't have you walking around looking like some delinquent." Daniel staggered back, gripping his crutch for balance. His left leg ached under his weight. He wasn't just some random kid. He was disabled, and Karen knew it. And she still did this. The neighbors watched from their porches, their faces filled with a mixture of horror and hesitation. "Don't one!" No one stepped forward, no one stopped her. Because no one dared to cross, Karen Whitmore dug his throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his mind felt frozen in shock. Then a voice shattered the silence. "What? Did you just do?" It was deep, cold, commanding. Karen's smug expression faltered. She turned slowly, her gaze landing on the towering figure at the end of the driveway. A man stood there, his broad shoulders tense, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury. Daniel blinked through his tears, his chest tightening. "Dad?" Karen's sneer returned, though it was less confident now. "Oh, Matthew," she said, forcing a laugh. "No need for the theatrics. I was just helping your son. You should thank me, really. He looks much more appropriate now." The air grew heavy. Chief Matthew Carter, not just Daniel's father, but the chief of police, took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Appropriate?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Karen lifted her chin. "Long hair on boys violates the HOA grooming policy. It lowers property values. I had to do what's best for the community." Matthew breathed in sharply, his jaw clenching. His knuckles turned white. "Let me get this straight," he said, stepping close. His voice did not rise, but there was a lethal weight behind it. "You cut my son's hair without permission? Humiliated him? Put your hands on a disabled child?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. I barely touched him." "Karen," Matthew said, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper, "you just committed assault." The color drained from Karen's face. Daniel watched, his breath caught in his throat. His father was furious, but not yelling, not threatening. That was the scariest part, because when his father got quiet like this, it meant someone was about to regret their life choices. Karen scoffed, though her voice shook slightly. "Let's not be dramatic. I was just enforcing community rules." Matthew tilted his head. "Community rules?" He pulled out his phone, tapping a few buttons. Karen's smirk wavered. "Yes," she said, folding her arms. "As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce all appearance standards." "Interesting." Matthew's eyes glowed with something dangerous. He turned his phone screen toward her. "Because according to the HOA bylaws, Section 14C, no board member can physically touch, alter, or damage a resident's property or person." Karen's breath hitched. "This is legally binding," Matthew continued. "And under state law, what you just did to my son, that's battery." Karen took a step back. "That's ridiculous. Oh, it gets better." Matthew smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "As chief of police, I have a duty to enforce the law, and lucky for you, I'm feeling especially motivated today." Karen paled. "You wouldn't," she whispered. Matthew took another step forward. "You really want to test that theory?" The silence in the neighborhood was deafening. The once untouchable Karen Whitmore, queen of the HOA, was visibly shaking. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He had never seen his father like this. "Now," Matthew continued, voice cool and lethal, "you have two choices. One, You publicly apologize to my son, step down as HOA president, and never speak to us again." Karen gawked at him. "Or," she asked weakly, "or I have you arrested right now for assaulting a disabled minor." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Karen's lips parted, her face twisting in disbelief. Daniel watched her carefully, his heart pounding. Was she really about to fight back, or was she about to fall from grace right here and now? For the first time in years, Karen looked afraid. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. Her usual confidence, the smug superiority she always carried, had vanished. The neighbors watched in silence. The tension so thick, it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Chief Carter kept his cold, unwavering stare locked on her. His police badge glinted under the afternoon sun, a silent reminder that this wasn't just any confrontation. This was a legal battle she wasn't prepared for. Karen finally stammered. "I was just what?" Carter cut in, his voice dangerously low. "Just assaulting my son. Just violating the law. Just humiliating a disabled child in front of his home." Karen swallowed. Her face was losing its usual color, shifting from deep red rage to something much paler, something that almost looked like fear. A nervous cough sounded from the crowd. People were watching closely now, and for the first time, it seemed like Karen's reign over the HOA wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Daniel, standing beside his father, still shaken and humiliated, felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Power. He had never seen anyone stand up to Karen like this before. "Chief Carter," Karen started, her voice regaining some of its usual condescension, "I don't appreciate your tone. I was simply—" Carter took a step forward. Karen flinched. "My tone," he repeated, his voice quiet, controlled, yet filled with authority that sent a chill down her spine. Karen instinctively took a step back. She had never seen this side of him before. "I'll ask you one last time," Carter said, his voice calm but undeniably lethal. "Apologize, now." The entire neighborhood held its breath. Karen's jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like she would refuse, but then, "I'm sorry," she muttered. Daniel blinked in shock. "Louder," Carter said. Karen's fists tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked around as if searching for support, but the neighbors were no longer on her side. She swallowed hard and forced the words out. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have touched your son's hair." Silence. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore looked small. But Chief Carter wasn't finished. "Now," he continued, stepping even closer, "you will resign as HOA president, effective immediately." Karen's head snapped up. Her shock turned to rage. "You have no authority to tell me that?" Carter smirked. "Oh, but I do." Karen froze. Carter pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. A few seconds later, he turned it toward the neighbors. Everyone leaned in to look. A video started playing, and it was Karen cutting Daniel's hair, sneering, degrading him, and publicly humiliating a disabled child. Karen's face drained of color. Someone in the crowd gasped, "Holy crap!" A neighbor whispered, "She actually did it." "You filmed me!" Karen shrieked, her voice losing its usual icy control. "Oh no," Carter said smoothly. "I didn't, but they did." He gestured to the crowd. A few neighbors looked away uncomfortably, but others stood firm. One of them still holding up their phone, live-streaming the entire conversation. Karen spun toward the cul-de-sac, her eyes wild. You can't." "Did you forget, Karen?" Carter asked, tilting his head. "Your little HOA empire. It's just a neighborhood. The law still exists." Karen trembled. Her usual iron grip over the HOA was slipping through her fingers. But she wasn't done yet. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "This neighborhood is mine. My rules, my standards. You're not getting rid of me that easily." Carter's smirk grew wider. "Oh, Karen," he said, slipping his badge from his belt and flashing it directly in front of her face. "I was never trying to get rid of you. I was just making sure that when you fall, it's hard enough that you never stand up again." Karen staggered back, her hands shaking. Daniel, still standing beside his father, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Karen Whitmore, the most feared woman in the HO, was finally crumbling. But it wasn't over, not yet, because Karen wasn't going to go down quietly, and the HOA war had just begun. Karen Whitmore had spent years building her empire within the neighborhood, ensuring that no one dared to question her authority. She wasn't just the HOA president, she was the queen, ruling over the cul-de-sac with an iron grip. From the moment she took charge, she had implemented strict policies, claiming they were for the betterment of property values. In reality, these rules existed solely to give her absolute control. Grass could only be exactly 3 inches tall, no more, no less. No one could have more than 1 vehicle in their driveway overnight, regardless of the number of drivers in a household. She banned certain paint colors, refused to approve backyard renovations unless they were to her personal taste, and fined families for the smallest violations. Most residents didn't dare oppose her. Those who tried were either flooded with violations or mysteriously found themselves the subject of anonymous complaints that led to costly HOA penalties. The worst part? Karen had friends in high places. The HOA board members were her puppets, nodding along to every ridiculous proposal, terrified of what would happen if they crossed her. They owed their positions to her, and she reminded them of it constantly. If anyone challenged her, she would threaten them with lawsuits, smear campaigns, and fines so outrageous that some residents were forced to sell their homes just to escape her wrath. That was her power, and until now, no one had ever been able to stop her. For years, Karen had operated like a dictator, but her true strength lay in her ability to break people without ever lifting a finger. The intimidation, the backroom deals, and the quiet threats all worked together to create a neighborhood that existed under her complete control. She never had to physically attack anyone before, because she never needed to. Just a single email from her, a casual suggestion at an HOA meeting, and she could turn the entire neighborhood against a person overnight. Those who didn't comply with her rules found their trash mysteriously uncollected, their driveways flagged for minor cracks, their mail lost. Karen had eyes everywhere. She knew which residents had been late on their HOA dues, who had parked their car slightly over the property line, and which families had received warnings before but failed to comply. She was always watching, always waiting for someone to slip up, and when they did, she would pounce. The power she wielded wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about instilling fear. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones about her, afraid to step out of line. Even those who hated her followed her orders, because defying her meant suffering the consequences. But what terrified Karen the most was that her usual tactics weren't working on Chief Carter. For the first time in her reign of terror, Karen was dealing with someone who wasn't afraid of her, and that infuriated her. Chief Carter had humiliated her in front of the neighborhood, exposed her for the bully she was, and, worst of all, made her look weak. She hated feeling weak. That night, she called an emergency meeting with the HOA board, demanding they take immediate action against Carter and his family. "He's a threat to this community," she spat, pacing in her living room as the board members sat awkwardly on her expensive leather couches. "He's trying to undermine our authority, and if we don't do something now, we will lose control." But instead of their usual nods of obedient agreement, the board members shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the video, they had heard the whispers, and they knew something Karen refused to acknowledge. Carter was right, and the neighborhood was starting to realize it too. "Karen," one of the board members finally said, clearing his throat, "maybe we should just let this go. It's not worth making a bigger issue." Her eyes snapped to him like a predator locking onto prey. "Let it go?" she repeated, her voice icy. "Are you suggesting we let an outsider, someone who clearly doesn't understand HOA policies, walk all over us?" The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, the fear in their eyes evident. Karen had never been questioned before. Not like this. Not by her own people. And it sent a chill down her spine. She realized for the first time that her grip on the HOA was slipping. Chief Carter hadn't just embarrassed her. He had planted a seed of doubt that could destroy everything she had built. Karen straightened her back, refusing to accept defeat. If the board was too spineless to act, then she would have to handle this herself. And this time she wouldn't just go after Daniel's hair, she would go after Carter's entire family. The war had begun. and Karen intended to win. Karen waited for the perfect moment. If she was going to teach Chief Carter and his family a lesson, she had to be calculated. The HOA board might have grown hesitant, but that didn't matter. She had ruled this neighborhood for years without their approval. One weak police chief and his crippled son weren't going to ruin her empire. So she watched, observed. She noted Carter's schedule, the way he left for work at the station every morning. She watched his wife, how she ran errands in the afternoon, and most importantly, she watched Daniel, how he hated leaving the house since the haircut, how he barely even stepped onto the porch anymore. That was her goal. To make him disappear, to force Carter's family into submission. And then, one afternoon, she saw her chance. Daniel had come outside, his head still awkwardly uneven from the hair she had cut. He clutched his crutch tightly, his body still adjusting to his disability. Carter wasn't home. His mother was inside, probably distracted. The driveway was empty, the cul-de-sac unusually quiet. Karen's lips curled into a smile. It was time. She moved fast. Too fast for Daniel to react. One moment he was struggling with the crutch, trying to place a package on the front steps. The next, Karen was there, standing over him like a shadow. "Still sulking?" she asked, her voice mocking. Daniel's fingers tightened around the crutch, his body tensing. "Go away." "Oh, but Daniel," she cooed. "This is my neighborhood. You don't get to tell me what to do." She took a step forward and he instinctively staggered back, his balance wobbly. Karen's smirk deepened. She loved that look, the fear, the helplessness. It reminded her of all the other residents she had crushed beneath her rules. But Daniel? He was about to learn what real humiliation felt like. She lunged, fast. Before he could react, she snatched the crutch from his grasp. Daniel's eyes widened in horror, his body swaying dangerously. He reached for support, but there was nothing to hold on to, and then he fell. The impact was sickening. His body hit the pavement hard, his left leg twisting in an unnatural angle. A sharp, pained cry escaped his lips, but Karen didn't flinch. She stood there, holding his crutch like a trophy, watching as he struggled to push himself up. "See what happens when you act entitled," she sneered, flipping the crutch between her hands. "You fall, just like your father will." Daniel's breathing was shaky, his arms trembling as he tried and failed to push himself off the ground. Tears burned his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Karen had already taken his hair, his confidence. He wouldn't give her his dignity too. He lifted his chin, glaring up at her. "You're going to regret this." Karen laughed, tossing the crutch aside like garbage. "Oh, sweet boy," she whispered, leaning down so only he could hear. "I never regret anything." And then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him helpless on the ground. What Karen didn't realize, what she failed to notice in her rush to feel powerful, was that she wasn't alone. Someone had been watching the entire thing, a neighbor, standing behind the safety of their fence, their phone raised high, camera rolling. The second Karen disappeared into her house, the neighbor bolted, running toward Daniel, helping him sit up. "Are you okay?" they asked breathlessly, their hands shaking from what they had just witnessed. Daniel's body ached, his pride stung, but his mind? It was sharp, focused, because this time Karen had done something she couldn't take back. She had done something criminal. Daniel winced, taking the neighbor's hand. "You recorded that?" he asked. "Every second." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Daniel smiled, because this time Karen had made a mistake, and his father was about to make her pay for it. The pain in Daniel's leg throbbed relentlessly as he limped back to the house, the humiliation of the fall still fresh in his mind. His hands shook as he gripped the doorframe to steady himself. He wasn't sure if it was his leg or the weight of everything else that made him feel so weak. His heart was still racing, his emotions a chaotic mix of anger and helplessness. He had been humiliated. Again. His hair was still uneven, though he'd done his best to cover the damage. But nothing could change the fact that Karen had taken so much more from him than his appearance. She had taken his sense of safety, his confidence. He wanted to yell, he wanted to scream at her, at everyone, for standing by and doing nothing. But most of all, he wanted to be normal again, not the disabled kid Karen had decided was too much of a problem. As he made his way to his room, he passed the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of himself. The boy in the reflection wasn't him. The image staring back at him seemed like a shadow, a version of himself he couldn't recognize. He clenched his fists and turned away. He couldn't take it. Daniel collapsed onto his bed, curling up into a tight ball. The tears finally came, rushing down his cheeks like a dam that had been holding back years of frustration. He didn't cry often. His father had always taught him to be strong, to be tough, to handle things on his own. But today was different. Today it felt like everything had been ripped away. His father, the police chief, wasn't there. His mother was still out shopping. He was alone in his room, completely vulnerable. The silent sobs racked his body, and for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of his disability as a burden. He couldn't fight back, couldn't even stand up to Karen. Not when it felt like the whole world was pushing him down. His self-esteem had been crushed, not just by Karen's actions, but by his own feelings of inadequacy. "Why do I have to be different?" he whispered to himself, staring at the ceiling. He hated feeling like this. Powerless. Meanwhile, Chief Carter was pacing in the kitchen, his mind racing. He had just gotten the video from the neighbor who had witnessed the entire thing. He had seen how Karen had grabbed Daniel's crutch, pushed him down, and left him on the ground to suffer. It was hard to process. The woman he had known for years as a neighbor and a supposed leader of their community had just committed a crime, a violent crime. Carter was not one to act rashly. As a police officer, he had been trained to remain calm in tense situations. But this was different. This was personal. His son, the sweet boy who had always tried his best despite the challenges, was now dealing with the aftermath of someone who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved. A sickening thought. His heart was heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He was furious, but more than that, he was heartbroken for his son. It wasn't long before Carter's wife, Sarah, came home, her face lighting up as she stepped through the door. But that light quickly faded when she saw her son's swollen eyes and the red streaks on his cheeks. "Daniel," she whispered, rushing to his side. She crouched down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What happened?" Daniel couldn't speak at first. The words stuck in his throat, and all he could do was shake his head, trying to hold back the flood of tears that threatened to come. But his mother's soothing voice finally broke through the walls he had built. "Honey, we need to talk about this," she said softly. "It's okay to feel upset, but you don't have to do this alone." Daniel looked up at her, his tear-filled eyes meeting hers. I feel like I'm just a burden," he whispered. "Like I'm just too much." Sarah's heart broke at his words, but she didn't know how to fix it. She couldn't take the pain away. She could only be there, be his support. And that's exactly what she did. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, offering the only kind of comfort she knew how to give. But as the day passed and night began to fall, Carter's anger simmered. He had promised his son that he would fix this, that Karen would pay for what she had done. But his wife's words echoed in his mind. "We need to fix this the right way. We need to make sure it's legal." But Carter was tired of waiting, tired of seeing his son suffer. He had done his best to keep his work life and family life separate, but Karen had crossed the line, and now it was time for her to feel the consequences. Carter took a deep breath, pulling out his phone. It was time to make the first move. Chief Carter didn't waste a moment. The minute Daniel had fallen asleep, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, Carter set his plan into motion. The quiet of the night gave him the perfect cover to begin investigating. Karen Whitmore had made a grave mistake. What she thought was just a small act of petty revenge, cutting his son's hair, humiliating him in front of the neighborhood, had unleashed a storm. Carter was no longer going to be the silent bystander. This was personal now. He wasn't going to wait for a legal process to drag on for months. He had resources at his disposal, connections, and as chief of police, there were few places his reach didn't extend. Carter fired up his laptop and began searching for anything that could give him a way to bring Karen down. The more he dug, the more disgusted he became. He started with her background, her time as an HOA president, the neighborhood complaints, and her relationship with other board members. As he scrolled through the public records, his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. Unexplained fund transfers from the HOA's account to Karen's personal account. Carter's fingers paused over the keyboard, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The HOA's funds were supposed to be used for community improvements, not for personal gain, but what he was looking at now was a pattern of large, irregular withdrawals. They didn't look like mere mistakes. These were planned, carefully executed. Karen had been funneling money from the HOA, from the neighborhood, into her own pocket. Carter clicked through the transactions, his heart pounding in his chest. Thousands of dollars. Unaccounted for. Some of it went to local businesses, but not for the neighborhood's benefit. Carter knew exactly what this was. Embezzlement. Karen had been stealing from the very people she had bullied, using her position to line her own pockets. But the more he read, the more he realized there was something even darker. As he dug deeper into Karen's personal records, he found the name of a business, an unregistered company that was connected to her. She had been using the HOA funds to bribe city officials, funneling money to help her friends and family bypass local regulations. The more he uncovered, the more enraged he became. With his jaw clenched, Carter picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew would change everything. It was time to take action. The call rang 3 times before a voice picked up. "Detective Thompson," the voice said, gruff and professional. Carter didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thompson, I need you to pull everything on Karen Whitmore. I've got proof she's been embezzling HOA funds. I need it all. Bank records, business dealings, any connections she has. I want it all by morning." There was a pause before Thompson responded. "Got it, Chief. You'll have everything you need." Carter ended the call without another word. He wasn't going to wait for the long process of formal investigations. No. This was about justice, about showing Karen just how far her arrogance and abuse of power had taken her. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Carter's phone buzzed. Detective Thompson's email popped up with an attachment. Carter opened it, his eyes scanning the data quickly. It was worse than he'd thought. Karen's fraud wasn't just a matter of embezzlement. She had bribed local officials, arranged for false permits, and even siphoned off HOA funds to fund a fake charity. Everything had been hidden behind a complex web of fake transactions and secret shell companies. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. Carter could feel the fire rising inside him. He knew this was it, the perfect opportunity to take Karen down once and for all. This wasn't just about the haircut anymore. This was about holding her accountable for every person she had intimidated, every dollar she had stolen, and every rule she had broken to maintain her grip on the neighborhood. Carter quickly began drafting a plan to expose Karen. He wasn't going to let her escape justice. His hands shook with a mix of anger and adrenaline as he prepared to go public with everything. He had the evidence. He had the proof. He was done playing games. It was time to bring Karen down, and he wasn't going to stop until she paid for every single thing she'd done. But as he typed out his message, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Thompson. It was a local reporter, someone Carter had worked with before. "Chief Carter, we've just gotten wind of something. The video of Karen cutting your son's hair. It's already gone viral. People are demanding answers. The community is asking for action, and so are we. Are you prepared to speak out?" Carter clenched his fists. The time had come. He was done being patient. He was ready to make his move. The moment the video of Karen cutting Daniel's hair went viral, the entire neighborhood seemed to shift. It spread like wildfire, faster than anyone could have anticipated. Social media buzzed with outraged posts from residents, neighbors who had remained silent for years, now speaking up. Everyone had witnessed the humiliation of a disabled child, but now they were finally starting to see the truth about the woman who had held them all captive for so long. People who had once been afraid to speak against Karen now began to share their own stories of bullying, unfair fines, and overbearing demands that Karen had imposed under the guise of upholding HOA policies. The posts snowballed into a movement. Suddenly, Karen wasn't the untouchable queen of the HOA anymore. She was the villain, an abuser of power who had taken advantage of the very people who trusted her. Carter didn't even need to make a public statement at first. The people were already rising up, and once they started, it was impossible to stop. Carter's phone rang off the hook with calls from neighbors demanding to know what the police were going to do about Karen. Anger and outrage were palpable in every conversation. Everyone wanted action. Fast. People showed up at his door, some with signs, others with written complaints about Karen's years of exploitation. The entire neighborhood seemed to be demanding justice. They were tired of living in fear of a woman who had made their lives miserable for far too long. Carter had seen the power of community before, but this was something different. The people were no longer going to be controlled by fear. They had come together. It was a wave of change, one that Karen couldn't escape, and it was all because of her own arrogance. But even as the storm began to form, Karen didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down, calling a community meeting that very evening. She wasn't going to lose her grip without a fight. Karen walked into the meeting with her head held high, her scornful gaze sweeping across the crowd as she made her way to the front. Not one person stood to greet her. Her usual tight-knit group of supporters was nowhere to be found. Instead, she was met with cold, hostile stares from every corner of the room. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. But she wasn't about to show weakness. She stood tall, her voice projecting as she began to speak. "I know many of you are upset," she started, her tone condescending as ever. "But I have done nothing wrong. The HOA's rules are in place for a reason, and I will not apologize for maintaining order." But as she spoke, something shifted. One by one, residents began to stand up, each one expressing their frustration, their disappointment in the woman who had run their lives for so long. "You've made our lives a living hell, Karen," one neighbor, Mr. Hall, said, his voice shaking with rage. "I'm tired of your constant fines, your ridiculous rules. You've made this neighborhood a prison." Karen's face reddened as the collective anger grew louder. Another neighbor, Mrs. Carter, chimed in. "You've made our homes into your personal business, taking money, lying to the board, breaking the law. We're done with you." Karen's smug expression began to crack as the room erupted into a chorus of dissent. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of voices rising over hers drowned her out. They were done listening. Done being afraid. The last bit of her influence had slipped through her fingers, and in that moment she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community she had manipulated and tormented for years. The long-awaited reckoning had finally arrived, and Karen had no one to stand with her. Not anymore. Carter stood in the back of the room, quietly watching, hearing. He had known that the community would eventually unite, but even he hadn't expected it to happen this quickly, this powerfully. The tide had officially turned, and there was no going back for Karen. The final piece of evidence had been revealed. The residents had spoken up, and the lawsuit Carter was preparing would hit hard. But that wasn't. The time for subtlety was over. The neighborhood needed to see justice served. They needed to see that Karen's reign had ended, and it was time for Carter to make the final move. It was the day after the community meeting, and the energy in the neighborhood had shifted completely. People who had once been afraid of Karen, or at the very least unwilling to speak up, were now united. The cracks in Karen's armor were widening, and with each passing hour, more and more residents were coming forward with their own stories of manipulation, intimidation, and control. But Karen wasn't about to just give up. No, she still had one final weapon she could use to regain control. And she intended to use it. The air was thick with anticipation as Karen stood at the front of the HOA boardroom, her jaw clenched and her eyes scanning the room. This wasn't going to be a regular HOA meeting. No, this was her last stand, and she was going to make sure the neighborhood knew she wasn't finished yet. "I'm not leaving," Karen said, her voice low but filled with venom. "This is my neighborhood, and I will fight for it. The truth is, I've been a good leader, and you all know it." She shot a glance toward Chief Carter, who stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "You people wouldn't know what to do without me. I have built this neighborhood from the ground up. I'm the reason we have structure, the reason this place has value." Her eyes locked onto a few residents, daring them to disagree, but instead of the fearful silence that Karen was used to, the room seemed to pulse with something new, something that made Karen's blood run cold. It was disdain, disgust. People weren't afraid anymore, and the reason was simple. They had finally seen her for what she was. The mask was off. They had heard the stories, they had seen the videos, and now they were starting to realize just how much power she had abused for her own benefit. Karen's grip tightened on the podium, her hands shaking. "You think you can just destroy everything I've worked for? You think I'll just stand by while my entire reputation is ruined? I'll make sure you regret this. I will sue every one of you if I have to. I'll make sure your lives are miserable. You'll never get rid of me." At this, Chief Carter pushed off the wall and stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Karen, I'm done talking. You've been playing this game for far too long. This isn't just about your rules anymore. This is about your crimes. And I'm going to make sure you face them." The room fell into a heavy silence. Everyone was waiting for Karen to crack, for her to finally admit defeat. But instead, she snapped. "You think you can just take me down like that? You think I'm scared of you? Let me tell you something. If you think I'm just going to walk away, you're wrong. You have no idea what I'm capable of. You don't know what I've done." Her voice shook with a bitter laugh, but her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, told a different story. Carter didn't flinch. "I already know, Karen, and now so does everyone else." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Karen, in her desperation to stay in control, had gone too far. She had made a fatal mistake, and Carter had the proof. In the last few hours, he had discovered more damning evidence, more illegal activities, more shady dealings, and, most importantly, her secret attempt to destroy the lives of those who stood in her way. She had been working behind the scenes to sabotage the very neighborhood she had once claimed to protect. The final revelation was too much. Her personal vendetta against Carter and his family had crossed the line into criminal activity. In a flash, Carter pulled out a file, a thick one, filled with documents, photographs, and bank records that Karen had thought were hidden forever. "You've been stealing, Karen. You've been manipulating your way into the pockets of our neighbors, using your power to control them for your own gain, and that ends now." He placed the file on the table for all to see. Karen's face turned an unnatural shade of white as she recognized what was in those papers. She stood frozen, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't understand. You're done, Karen," Carter interrupted, his voice hard. "You're going to face every consequence for what you've done. I'm pressing charges. This is over." The room exploded into murmurs, the residents buzzing with excitement, shock, and disbelief. They had watched Karen for years, terrified of her influence, but now they were witnessing her collapse. The woman who had been their ruler was now on the verge of losing everything. Her power was gone, and with it, her ability to control the lives of everyone in this neighborhood. But Karen wasn't done yet. As Carter turned to leave, she rushed to the front of the room, desperation in her eyes. "I won't let you do this. I won't let you ruin me." Her voice trembled with a raw edge of fear. Carter didn't even turn around. "You should have thought of that before you made this personal. You've done enough damage." And with that, Karen's reign was over. Karen stood at the front of the HOA meeting room, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. She had just witnessed her entire world crumble. Everything she had worked for, every lie she had carefully constructed, was now exposed for all to see. The community had turned against her. The police chief had caught her in a web of deceit. She was facing charges that would ruin her life, but Karen wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to go down like this. Not without a fight. As the room began to settle into whispers, Karen took a deep breath. Desperation was starting to seep into her thoughts, clouding her judgment, but she still had one last card to play. She knew that if she couldn't win through power or intimidation, she could at least cause chaos. That's what she did best. She would find a way to take Carter down with her, to make sure that no one would forget her name. Without warning, Karen reached into her bag. and pulled out a handwritten letter, something that no one had seen coming. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice now full of defiance. "You think you've won, Carter? You think exposing my mistakes will save you? You have no idea who you're really messing with." The crowd fell silent. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what Karen was about to say, but Carter wasn't worried, not yet. He stood there, his arms crossed as Karen continued. "I've always had power in this neighborhood," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But you, Chief Carter, you've gone too far. I've had a lot of time to think about everything that's happened, and let me tell you something. I know your secret." Carter's expression didn't change, but he could feel the weight of her words. What secret was she talking about? Karen's lips curled into a sly smile. "You really thought I didn't know? You've been hiding something from everyone. You're not as perfect as you think you are, Carter Dot. I've got a letter that could ruin you just as easily as you think you've ruined me." The room gasped. People were already on edge from the explosive revelations about Karen's embezzlement, but now they were starting to look at Carter differently. What was she talking about? What secret did she know? Karen's voice dropped to a whisper as she leaned forward. "I've got proof that you've been using your position as chief of police for personal gain. Maybe not in the way you think, but I have the evidence. A little something I found while I was digging around." Carter's heart skipped a beat. This was impossible. He had been careful. He had always followed the law. There was no way she could know about his past. But Karen didn't stop there. "I've got phone records, emails, and even witnesses. Dot. I know about the deals you've made, the people you've protected in exchange for favors, and I know about the money you've received under the table for turning a blind eye to certain things." "You want to threaten me, Carter? Well, I'm threatening you now." The crowd was in shock, and Carter's mind raced. His thoughts were a blur as he tried to piece together what Karen was saying. Could this be true? Had someone manipulated the evidence? Had she planted false information to make him look guilty? Karen wasn't finished yet. "I could expose you. I could ruin your career, your family, just like that." She snapped her fingers. "You're not untouchable, Carter. If I go down, I'm bringing you with me." Carter took a step forward, his jaw clenched tightly. This wasn't just a threat. She was playing dirty, and he couldn't afford to underestimate her. He needed to stay calm, think logically, but there was something inside him that was starting to boil. The injustice, the audacity, the way she thought she could control everything. "If you think for 1 second that you're going to scare me," Carter said, his voice steady but full of authority, "you're wrong. I know everything about you, Karen. I've already seen the evidence of your crimes. I've seen it all. Your theft, your bribery, your manipulation. You've made a lot of enemies, and I'm one of them." Karen's eyes flickered with uncertainty for just a moment, but she quickly masked it with her trademark arrogance. "You're just bluffing, Carter. I know you can't prove anything about me, but I can prove everything about you." There was silence as the weight of Karen's words hung in the air. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Carter knew he had to act quickly before Karen's accusations could take root. He couldn't let her drag his reputation through the mud. But what if she was telling the truth? What if she had the evidence to ruin him, and he hadn't been careful enough? But Carter was not going to back down. He couldn't. He had already come too far, and he wasn't going to let Karen's lies destroy everything he had worked for. "I'm going to make sure you pay for every single thing you've done, Karen," Carter said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You've crossed the line one too many times, and now it's over. I'll take you down the legal way, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Karen's face twisted with fury as she tried to hold on to the power she had once held, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was running out of time, and her empire was collapsing. The battle was no longer just about Daniel's hair, it was about justice, and Karen's time had come. The meeting room had become a battlefield, the air thick with tension and unspoken threats. Karen, despite the palpable fear creeping into her voice, still clung to her power like a drowning woman clutching at a life raft. Her accusations were hanging in the air, daring anyone to challenge them. The room had shifted in an instant. The once united front against her had now splintered, with some residents beginning to look at Chief Carter with doubt. Could it be true? Was he just as corrupt as she claimed? The whispers started, subtle at first, but louder, faster. Carter didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. He had been in law enforcement too long to fall for a bluff, but Karen's words, however fabricated, had planted a seed of doubt. He was starting to realize that Karen's plan wasn't just about discrediting him. No, this was something much bigger. This was her final strike, a last attempt to create confusion and paralyze his response. If she couldn't destroy him outright, she could at least make everyone question the integrity of his actions, blur the lines enough that his victory wouldn't be absolute. But Carter had an advantage. He had prepared for this moment. The evidence he had gathered on Karen, on her countless acts of fraud, her destruction of the very neighborhood she claimed to protect, was solid. There was no way out for her, and he knew it. All he had to do now was expose her lies for what they were. But first, he needed to take control of the room. He took a step forward, letting his presence fill the space, commanding the attention of everyone present. "Karen," he said, his voice steady and cutting through the murmurs, "if you think I'm bluffing, you're sorely mistaken. I have every piece of evidence to prove your corruption, every single transaction, every email, every witness. I've already filed the charges." Karen's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to reveal his hand so quickly. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Carter wasn't giving her the satisfaction of a prolonged argument. He was taking back the power. "You've spent years bullying the residents of this neighborhood, using your position to line your pockets. You've broken laws, manipulated people, and destroyed lives, all in the name of your so-called neighborhood standards," Carter continued, his voice growing louder, more authoritative. "But now? It's time for you to face the consequences. You won't be destroying anyone else." The room fell into absolute silence as Carter's words sunk in. Karen, for the first time, looked vulnerable. The confidence, the smugness, drained from her face. This wasn't just a battle for control over the HOA anymore. This was about exposing her for who she really was. A criminal, a liar, and a bully. "Carter, I didn't mean—" Karen stammered, but she was cut off by a loud knock on the door. All eyes turned toward it as the door opened and two uniformed officers entered the room. One of them was Detective Thompson, the same officer Carter had worked with earlier. "Chief," Thompson said, his tone official, "we have a warrant for Mrs. Whitmore's arrest. You're going to need to come with us." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "What? No, this is a mistake," she screamed, but her voice faltered as the officers stepped forward, removing her from the room. The residents watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to say, what to feel. This was it. Karen had finally been caught, exposed for the fraud she was. The community's tormentor was being taken away, and for the first time in years the neighborhood felt lighter, like the weight of 1,000 oppressive rules had been lifted from their shoulders. But Carter didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was still a lingering weight on his chest, the doubt, the fear that perhaps the damage had already been done. How many lives had Karen ruined? How many families had she crushed beneath the weight of her petty rules? There was no turning back now. No way to undo the years of terror she had inflicted on the neighborhood. "Is it over?" one of the neighbors, Mrs. Thompson, asked hesitantly. The question lingered in the air. Was it truly over? Had Karen's downfall fixed everything? Or was it just the beginning of a much longer journey to heal from the damage she had caused? Carter's gaze drifted toward Daniel's room. His son had been through so much, and this victory, while satisfying, didn't feel like enough. He wasn't sure when it would, or if it ever would, but one thing was clear. Karen had finally paid for her crimes. He just hoped the damage to the community, to his son, wouldn't linger for too long. He turned to face the residents. "It's over," he said firmly, though his voice was tinged with exhaustion. "But it's going to take time to rebuild. We've lost a lot, but we will find a way to heal, together." The room remained quiet, but a faint smile broke through the tension. For the first time in years, there was hope. The weeks following Karen's arrest were a blur. Life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new normal. The energy shifted, the oppressive weight of Karen's rules had finally lifted. But the damage she'd done to the community didn't disappear overnight. People were more cautious, less trusting, still unsure of who could be next to try to seize control. But there was an air of relief that couldn't be ignored. For the first time in a long time, the residents didn't feel like they had to tiptoe around their own homes. The freedom to live without fear of judgment, without the looming threat of fines or harassment, was priceless. But for Chief Carter, the journey wasn't over. Justice had been served, yes. Karen was in police custody, facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and assault, and her power was completely broken. Yet, Carter knew that his victory was only part of the equation. His son Daniel had paid a high price, not just for the haircut, but for the years of fear and isolation that Karen's reign had created. Despite everything Carter had done to ensure that Daniel was protected, the scars remained. Daniel still had trouble leaving the house some days. He still stared at his reflection, his confidence shaken, unsure if the world would ever see him the same way again. One evening, Carter found his son sitting by the window, staring into the darkening yard. It wasn't unusual for Daniel to retreat into himself after everything that had happened, but tonight there was something different in the air. A shift. A kind of quiet determination. Carter leaned against the doorframe, watching his son, unsure whether to interrupt or to let him have his moment. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I think I'm ready to go outside tomorrow." Carter felt a wave of relief wash over him. His son wasn't healed yet, but he was taking the first steps toward it. "You know I'll be right here," Carter said, his voice warm. "You don't have to do anything before you're ready." Daniel nodded, but there was something different in his eyes now, a spark of resilience that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about moving on, about getting better. I want to go out there and not feel like I'm hiding anymore. I don't want to be scared." Carter walked over and sat next to his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got nothing to be afraid of, Daniel. The neighborhood has your back now, and as for Karen, she's gone. And so is everything she stood for." Daniel smiled, but it was small, tentative. Still, it was a smile, and Carter was grateful to see it. The truth was, he didn't know how long it would take for his son to fully heal from everything Karen had done, but the journey had started, and that was enough for now. The next morning, as the sun rose over the cul-de-sac, Daniel stepped outside for the first time in weeks. He stood on the porch for a moment, taking in the fresh air. For a moment, the weight of the past few months didn't feel so heavy. The hum of the neighborhood, the distant chatter of neighbors walking by, felt almost normal. As he took his first few steps down the front walk, he looked around and noticed something different. The people who had once avoided him, who had been silent under Karen's rule, now looked at him with a different kind of respect. Some waved, some even smiled. There was a new unity in the neighborhood, one that Karen had tried to destroy, but one that had ultimately survived her cruelty. Daniel felt a knot loosen in his chest. Maybe things could get better. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of something new. Across the street, a familiar face waved at him. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had stood up against Karen during the last HOA meeting, waved enthusiastically. Daniel hesitated, but then he waved back. It was the first real connection he had felt in a long time. The world wasn't as cold as he'd once thought. And maybe, just maybe, the healing process had already begun. But as Daniel stood there, feeling the wind on his face, Carter's phone rang, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was Detective Thompson. A feeling of unease settled in his stomach. "Carter, I've got something you need to see," Thompson said, his voice serious. "We've got a new lead about Karen. It's going to change everything." Carter felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He had just begun to feel that things were settling down, but it seemed that Karen's mess wasn't finished yet. The final chapter of this saga wasn't over. The storm wasn't quite done. Carter felt the unease settle deeper in his gut as he listened to Detective Thompson's voice crackle over the phone. There was something in Thompson's tone that immediately set Carter on edge. He had hoped that after Karen's arrest, after everything had finally seemed to calm down, they could all begin to rebuild. but apparently there was still unfinished business. "What's this about?" Carter asked, his voice tight. "I'm not sure yet, but we've found something," Thompson said. "A new lead. It's about Karen, but this time it's not just about the embezzlement or the fraud. We've come across some documents that don't add up. Something isn't right, Chief." Carter's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced back to the last few weeks, to everything he thought he had wrapped up. "What do you mean, doesn't add up? We've got her on everything." "That's just it," Thompson continued, his voice lowering. "I went through the case files again, and something about the evidence feels off. Some of the transactions we were looking at seem to lead to other people we didn't consider. There's a shadowy network behind all of this, Chief, and it doesn't stop with Karen." Carter's pulse quickened. For weeks they had been so focused on Karen Whitmore, her actions, her manipulation, her role as the neighborhood tyrant. But now it seemed as though she wasn't the only one pulling strings. Someone else had been working behind the scenes, someone with influence, with power that went beyond Karen's HOA presidency. "Who?" Carter asked, a cold edge in his voice. Thompson hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I can't be sure yet, but there's a name that keeps popping up. Mark Rivers. He's a local contractor, and he's been involved in several of Karen's shady dealings. But it's more than just that. He's connected to other people who have ties to the local government. This goes deeper than just a few missing funds, Chief." The blood in Carter's veins turned to ice. Mark Rivers wasn't just any contractor. He was well connected, and his business was one of the most lucrative in town. Everyone knew his name, and everyone respected him, but no one ever questioned where his money came from, where his connections went. To Carter, this was no longer about Karen Whitmore. This was about something much darker. "This doesn't make sense," Carter muttered. "Why would Rivers be involved? What's his angle?" "That's what we need to figure out," Thompson replied. "I'm going to need your help on this one, Chief. We've got a long road ahead of us, and we need to go after the real source. If we don't stop this now, it's going to be too late." Carter's mind was racing. He thought he had won. He thought Karen's arrest was the end of it all, but now he realized it was only the beginning. The real enemy had been lurking in the background, manipulating the events from behind the scenes. And if Mark Rivers was involved, this wasn't just a simple case of corruption. It was a web of deceit that could spread far beyond their neighborhood. "We'll need to move fast," Carter said, his voice low and determined. "I'll have my team look into Rivers, get everything on him. Every record, every connection, every deal. We can't let him slip through our fingers." "I'm on it," Thompson confirmed. "But we need to be careful. This goes deeper than we thought. We might have enemies in places we can't see yet." Carter hung up the phone, his thoughts a storm of uncertainty and resolve. He had to act quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now stepping into something far darker than he had ever imagined. What had started as a personal vendetta against Karen Whitmore had become something much bigger. It was no longer just about righting the wrongs of one woman. It was about bringing down a system of corruption that ran much deeper than he had ever realized. Daniel was finally starting to find his footing, but Carter knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. His family had already suffered so much, but it seemed they were only now beginning to realize how far-reaching Karen's influence had gone. The deeper Carter dug, the more corruption he uncovered, and the more dangerous the fight would become. He glanced over at Daniel, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table. The boy was reading a book, but Carter could see the subtle wariness in his posture. Daniel had been through so much, and Carter couldn't bear the thought of dragging him back into a fight. But he also knew there was no turning back now. His family was in too deep, and the dark forces behind Karen Whitmore were still pulling strings. "Dad?" Daniel's voice interrupted his thoughts. Carter turned to face him, offering a tired smile. "We're going to be okay, son," Carter said, though he wasn't sure how much longer that would remain true. Daniel looked at his father with a slight frown. "I know, but what's happening? Why does it feel like this isn't over?" Carter's heart tightened. He wanted to tell his son that everything would be fine, but deep down he knew the truth. It wasn't over. And with that, They both knew that the battle they had started had just become something much bigger. The morning after the phone call with Detective Thompson, Carter couldn't shake the heavy feeling weighing on him. Mark Rivers wasn't just a contractor, he was a powerful man, deeply embedded in the fabric of the community. The discovery had shaken Carter to his core. Rivers wasn't merely involved in Karen Whitmore's actions, he was the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, using her to further his own agenda. The news of Rivers' involvement sent ripples through Carter's mind, and he found it hard to concentrate on anything else. His son Daniel was finally starting to heal, starting to feel like he could live again. But the weight of the hidden corruption around them had brought Carter's focus back to the fight he hadn't seen coming. Carter had always believed that exposing the truth was the key to ending this, but the more he learned, the more he realized that the truth wasn't enough. This wasn't about exposing Karen or even Rivers anymore. It was about taking down an entire network of corruption, power, and manipulation that had been running unchecked for far too long. This was bigger than him. He took a deep breath as he walked into the living room, where Daniel was sitting at the table, his books spread out in front of him. Daniel had been quiet lately, withdrawn even though his wounds were starting to heal. It was like he felt the weight of everything that had happened, everything Carter was involved in. "You okay?" Carter asked, sitting down across from his son. Daniel looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "Yeah, I'm good," he replied, though Carter could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Carter placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Listen, Daniel, I need to be honest with you. This thing with Karen, with Rivers, it's bigger than we thought. There's a lot of stuff going on that we can't ignore anymore." Daniel looked down at the table, his brow furrowing. "I figured that much. I need you to know that this won't be easy. We're not done yet." Carter's voice was firm, but there was a trace of guilt in it. He wished more than anything that he could just make everything right for Daniel, that he could shield him from this. But he knew, deep down, that they were in this together now. Daniel nodded slowly. "I know, Dad. I know you're trying your best." But Carter wasn't so sure. His best didn't seem enough anymore. Not when there was a network of corruption so deeply rooted in the community. Not when Daniel was still carrying the weight of the past few months. The phone rang, pulling Carter from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Detective Thompson again. "Carter?" Thompson's voice came through, his tone tight. "We've got a break in the case. We found something on Rivers, something we didn't expect. You need to come to the station." Carter's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find? It's better if I show you in person." "Just get here, now." Carter hung up the phone, his mind spinning. What could Thompson have found? What was it that could possibly bring Rivers down for good? He turned to Daniel, who had already stood up from the table. "I'll be back in a bit, kiddo," Carter said, his voice low. "Stay here. I'll update you when I can." Daniel looked up at him, his expression serious. "Be careful, Dad. I know things are getting complicated, but you can't let this destroy you. Don't let it turn into something worse." Carter stopped in his tracks, surprised by the weight of his son's words. "I won't, Daniel, I promise." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. The battle that was unfolding in front of him felt like it was going to consume him whole. When Carter arrived at the station, Thompson was already waiting for him, his face grim. "You're going to want to see this," he said, leading Carter to a back room where the latest evidence had been gathered. On the table in front of them was a folder with more documents. Papers that Carter immediately recognized as official contracts. But this wasn't just a paper trail. No, these were business deals, property agreements, and official records, all pointing to one thing. Rivers was not just a contractor. He had been leveraging his influence to control key aspects of the town's development, all in exchange for bribes and kickbacks. But what shocked Carter the most was the connection he found hidden within these records. There were multiple land deals tied to local government officials who had been protecting Rivers. "This is what we've been looking for," Thompson said, voice steady. "Rivers has his hands in the local government, Carter. He's been orchestrating these deals, controlling everything. and it looks like he's been paying off the right people to make sure it stays that way. Carter felt his stomach turn. Rivers wasn't just a part of Karen's mess, he was the ringleader. And now, with these documents, Carter had enough evidence to take him down. But there was still something nagging at him, something that didn't sit right. "You're telling me Rivers is tied to all of this?" Carter asked, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "How deep does this go?" Thompson grimaced. "It goes deeper than we thought. This isn't just about the HOA. Rivers has been controlling real estate, manipulating the housing market, and using his ties to the local government to profit off every development project in the area. And it gets worse. He's been using Karen to cover his tracks." Carter's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a fight for the neighborhood. This was about exposing the rot that had infected the entire town. And it was time to take down the real enemy. The pieces were coming together, but it wasn't going to be easy. Rivers was a dangerous man, but Carter had no choice. The time for playing by the rules was over. Now it was time for war. The next few days felt like a whirlwind of tension and anticipation, but Carter knew the endgame was near. But the closer he got to Rivers, the more the stakes seemed to rise. The information Thompson had uncovered was shocking, and it was clear now Rivers wasn't just some local contractor. He had his hands in everything, from real estate to political deals, all with the sole purpose of lining his pockets at the expense of everyone around him. Carter had known that Karen was just the tip of the iceberg, but now he understood just how deep the corruption ran. He'd been so focused on taking down Karen that he had failed to see the bigger picture. But now, Carter had a plan. He couldn't just arrest Rivers. Not yet. He needed the perfect moment, the final evidence that would make Rivers' downfall inevitable. Rivers had been careful, meticulous, hiding behind a network of puppets, but Carter had something he didn't expect, a community and a team of people who were ready to bring him down. As the days passed, the pressure of the situation began to weigh on Carter. It wasn't just his career or Rivers' empire that was at stake anymore, it was his family's future. His thoughts kept returning to Daniel, who had been so strong through everything, but still carried the emotional scars of everything Karen had put him through. Daniel's journey toward healing was far from over, and Carter felt the weight of that every time he looked at his son. The fight wasn't just for justice, it was for Daniel's future, one where he could finally live without fear. "Dad, you still haven't told me everything," Daniel said one evening, breaking the silence that had settled between them. They were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a soft, golden light. Daniel's voice was steady, though Carter could hear the underlying concern in his words. "I know this goes beyond Karen." "What's really going on?" Carter sighed, looking at his son. He had always promised to be open with Daniel, but now the truth felt harder to share than ever before. "You're right," Carter admitted. "Karen was just a piece of the puzzle. She was working with someone much bigger, much more dangerous. His name is Mark Rivers. He's been running this town for years, pulling the strings behind the scenes. He's been using Karen to cover up his crimes, fraud, bribery, the works." Daniel's eyes widened, his brow furrowing. "So, Karen wasn't just a bad neighbor?" "No," Carter said, his voice grim. "She was a pawn in his game, but she's not the only one who's been manipulated. There are other people involved, people who have been helping Rivers to maintain control. And now it's time to take him down." Daniel sat back, his hands in his lap as he processed what his father had just told him. "So, you're not just going after Karen, you're going after Rivers for everything he's done?" Carter nodded. "Exactly. But we're doing it the right way, Daniel. We're not going to make the same mistakes we made with Karen. We have to have everything, the proof, the evidence, to bring him down." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze focused on the street ahead. "I'm scared, Dad," he admitted softly. "Not for me, but for you. I don't want you to get hurt." Carter's heart ached at the sound of his son's voice, so full of fear. He had seen his son grow stronger every day since the ordeal began, but the weight of everything had clearly taken its toll. Carter reached over and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, offering him a smile. "I know, son. And I'm scared too, but sometimes we have to face the hardest battles to make sure the people we love have a future. You're the reason I'm doing this." Daniel nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Then we have to win, Dad. We have to make sure this ends for good." Carter looked at his son, feeling a sense of pride well up in him. For the first time since everything started, he felt like they had a real chance. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been wronged by Karen and Rivers, and for Daniel, who deserved to feel safe in his own home again. The next morning, Carter met with Detective Thompson, and they finalized their plan. Rivers' web of deceit had been slowly unraveling, but there was still work to be done. The final sting operation was set. They would catch Rivers' red hand in the act, with everything they needed to bring him down once and for all. As the time approached, Carter's anxiety mounted. He was walking a dangerous line, but the people he cared about, especially Daniel, depended on him. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about making sure that no one could ever hurt his family again. He had to take Rivers down. There was no other choice. The night before the operation, Carter stood at the window of his home, looking out at the street. He thought about how far they had come since everything began, how much the community had changed. He couldn't help but feel hope. This neighborhood, which had been under Karen's thumb for so long, was finally beginning to stand tall again. But as Carter turned away from the window, his phone buzzed. It was Detective Thompson. "We've got him," Thompson said, voice tight with urgency. "He's meeting with someone tonight. We've got eyes on the location. This is it. This is our chance to end this." Carter took a deep breath, his heart racing. Let's do it. The final chapter was about to begin. The night was dark, with only the faint glow of street lamps casting long shadows along the cul-de-sac. Carter stood beside Detective Thompson in the cramped stakeout van, his hands resting on the dashboard, his mind racing. Mark Rivers was finally going to be exposed, caught in the act, just like they had planned. For weeks they had carefully followed every lead, every transaction, and every movement of Rivers and his associates. The operation was set. The evidence was there. All that was left was to make sure Rivers didn't slip through their fingers, just like Karen had tried to do. Thompson looked over at Carter. "Everything's ready. This is it." Carter nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Daniel, who was waiting back at the house, still shaken by everything that had happened, but determined to face the future. Carter had promised his son that things would get better, that they would move on from Karen's reign of terror. But now, this fight wasn't just about Karen. It was about taking down the real threat, the person who had been manipulating everyone in the shadows. Rivers wasn't just a corrupt contractor, he was a criminal mastermind, using his influence to control every major deal in town, hiding behind layers of bribes and false promises. The moment he was arrested, everything would change. The town would be free from the stranglehold that had suffocated it for so long. A few minutes later, the operation was underway. Carter watched from the van as Rivers pulled up to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. His heart pounded as Rivers stepped out of his luxury car and entered the building. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Carter grabbed his radio, his voice firm. "This is it. We move in on my signal. On my count we go. Let's finish this." The radio crackled in response. "Copy that. We're ready." Carter took a deep breath, eyes locked on the warehouse. This was for the community, for Daniel and for everyone who had been affected by the corruption that had festered in their neighborhood for far too long. He had to get this right. 1, Carter muttered under his breath. 2, 3. The moment he said 3, the team surged into action. Officers stormed the building, their movements synchronized, their goal clear. Rivers had nowhere to run. Carter and Thompson were close behind, entering the warehouse with purpose. Inside, Rivers was caught off guard, standing frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, fake contracts, and documents that would seal his fate. "Mark Rivers," Carter said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, bribery, conspiracy, and corruption." Rivers's eyes flashed with shock, then a brief, desperate anger. "You don't know what you're doing. I've got people connections. I'm untouchable." Carter's eyes never wavered. Not anymore. With a swift motion, Thompson handcuffed Rivers, his face set with determination. "It's over, Rivers. You're going to prison." The weight of it all hit Carter in that moment. This was the end of an era, a dark chapter in the neighborhood's history, finally coming to a close. The justice that had been denied for so long had finally been served. But it wasn't just about rivers. It was about the community's victory, the collective strength that had risen up against the abuse of power. This wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was about ensuring that nothing like this would ever happen again. Carter had fought for his family. He had fought for Daniel. But now, he realized, this fight was for everyone who had been marginalized by people like Karen and Rivers. The arrest was just the beginning. With Rivers in custody, the floodgates opened. More arrests followed as Rivers' network of corruption unraveled. But Carter knew the true victory wasn't in seeing Rivers locked away. It was in seeing the community's revival. A few days later, as the last of the criminal charges were finalized, Carter and Daniel stood together outside their house, the sun setting behind them, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood. The atmosphere was different now, freer. The weight of Karen and Rivers' reign had been lifted. "You did it, Dad," Daniel said, his voice soft but filled with pride. "We did it." Carter smiled down at his son, feeling a rush of relief. "We did. And now we can move forward, together." As they stood there side by side, Carter realized that this wasn't just about taking down corrupt leaders. This was about family, about healing, and about starting anew. He had fought for his son, but he had also fought for a better future, for everyone in the neighborhood who had suffered in silence. It wasn't over yet, but the road ahead was clearer. And for the first time in a long time, Carter could finally breathe. The battle had been long and hard, but they had won. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories on Homeowners Association